Joining us on INSEAD Knowledge is Mike Pich, Affiliate Professor of Operations Management and Entrepreneurship at INSEAD. You're one of the authors of this book, Managing the Unknown.
Yes.
This specifically looked at project management, but how can companies aim to manage the unknown?
The fact that the future is unknown means that we have to deal with risk. We have to deal with risk at the time that we make the decisions and go forward. The classical approaches to risk management basically deal with a list of things. Number one, identifying possible events which may happen, which may impact the outcomes of your decisions. Then what you do is you begin to analyze those events. What is the potential impact of those events, and what's the probability these events may happen? Then you begin to rank those events. Which ones are more important? Are the more impactful ones important? The higher probability ones important? You begin to see you have some trade-offs here, how to deal with them. Once you've done that, then there are basically three approaches to managing risk. The first approach is what we call prevention. If you go to a construction site, you'll have a lot of safety banners. The whole point of these things is to prevent risks from happening. So one can try and prevent events from happening. That's the first one. Second one is mitigation, which is in case an event happens, can I take action now which would reduce the negative impacts of that event on my outcomes? Hard hats are a classic example. You wear a hard hat in case something hits you on the head, it mitigates the impact of that risk. The third one, and the most elaborate, of course, is what we call contingency planning. You plan for the contingency that this event may happen, and of course emergency response systems are a classic example of this. If an emergency happens, this is what you do, these are the routes you take, these are the places where we meet. You have a plan of action according to those. So this is kind of the standard approach to risk analysis or risk management that people take, and they take it either informally or formally. And people begin to feel comfortable when they do this because human beings don't like uncertainty. So if I have contingency plans, if I have mitigation, if I have prevention mechanisms, I feel like I've got a handle on what may happen in the future. Here's the problem though. There are many assumptions that happen. You're making either implicitly or explicitly when you do these kinds of analysis. Number one, we have to recognize that any event that I may identify is actually a creation in my mind. We're actually creating events, and we put labels on them. Financial crisis is an event. Of course, there are many states of the world which could fall under that title. So one of the things we must recognize is that when we say, quote unquote, identify events, we're actually not identifying events. We're creating events which are representations of possible future states of the world that we need to then respond to. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption is on the models of the world that we have in our brain, or the explicit models. We may have them in computers, we may have them on spreadsheets. Basically, if I'm going to understand the impact of a potential event on my outcomes, I must have a cause and effect model, either implicitly or explicitly, that I'm dealing with. So the second big assumption is, are the models that we have of the world adequate to our needs? The third assumption is the probability that these events will happen. These are all subjective probabilities, which means there's no real probability. It's just a measure of our understanding of the world and how likely these events might happen.
You mentioned the financial crisis.
Yeah.
We've seen a major failure of risk assessment, risk controls.
We are not very good at predicting the future, and the reason we're not very good at predicting the future is we're not very good at creating events which represent reality. Two, we're not very good at creating models which represent the cause and effects in the world. Number three, we're not very good at understanding subjective probability and interdependence of events that exist in the world. Because of that, anytime we create models which hope to deal with risk, in other words, predictions of the future, we're going to fail. And this is where our book comes in, which is, okay, then what do you do? What do you do if all these things are because I'm not saying they're bad, they're actually quite good. I think we misuse them. So what do we do in a world where it's difficult to predict, in a world where it's difficult to deal with uncertainty? Well, we have basically two approaches we need to think about. And they're very simple. Number one is learning, adaptive behavior, and number two is selectionism. So Learning is basically improving our understanding of the world through experience. So basically, learning says that any models we have which deal with events that we create, models that we use to create causal effect, and our subjective probabilities, need to be updated over time. We need to have actual mechanisms in place where we formally learn from feedback and we ask the question, is this telling us something about our ability to create events? Is this telling us something about our ability of our model to predict the future? We often lack that, right? So that feedback mechanism of being able to say, not only do I need to update my predictions, I need to update the models on which these predictions are made. That's very important. And this is hard to do. This is hard to do. And this is why people don't adopt it naturally. Because it takes effort. It consumes resources. People would rather apply resources to actually implementing the actions, delivery mode, if you will, than they would to actually improving the models on which actions are based. But time and time again, what has been shown is that we cannot predict the future. If we cannot predict the future, our actions are probably not the best set of actions. In fact, they may be infeasible.
What about the role of gut feeling, of intuition?
To me, whether it's gut feeling, whether it's planning, whether it's a bunch of geniuses in a room, I don't care where you start. The key is the process you use by which you judge the progress of that plan as you go forward. So for someone who's got gut feel, as long as they're willing to subject that gut feel to real feedback, I'm fine with it. I'm fine with it. It doesn't matter to me. So to me, I think you're going to make more progress in the feedback loops, in understanding and improving as you go than you are going to make at the beginning, which is to come up with the perfect design. One thing for sure is empirically determined is that no group of smart people will come up with a perfect design. It's impossible. So you can't predict the future. So no matter how many smart people you have in a room, you're not going to get the right plan. So is it going to be better than gut feel? Well, maybe in some instances, yes. In other instances, no. If I'm building a building, I don't want to rely on somebody's gut feel. But if I've got something else which is more, ambiguous and a little bit difficult to quantify, yeah, maybe gut feel makes sense. So to me, it's not so much the starting point. It's the process you use to improve that starting point as you go forward.
Just to summarize then, companies should be looking to evaluate the risks, the uncertainty, map out their plans, contingency plans, but then also take account of the feedback and be open to the feedback.
Absolutely, because I would never say don't do contingency planning. I think it's just very important, right? The key is don't let that create a false sense of security that somehow you've got it mapped out. Because the problem is that the contingency plan becomes the plan, right? It becomes the world within which you work, and you ignore everything outside as if it were some kind of fire that needs to be put out. So the contingency plan is important, but open yourself up to real feedback because you may need to modify that as you go. It's very important.
Mike Pich, INSEAD Professor, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.